Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how you doing? What we're going to talk about is something that I think would benefit all of us, okay? Especially knowing the history and that also history repeats itself. We're going to talk about rations and what rations were popular back during like World War II. And I feel that these are the same foods that will get rationed yet again. So, did you know that in December of 1941, the U.S. was cut off entirely from its Philippine sugar supply when Japan invaded the islands? In the Atlantic, sugar imports from Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands were impacted by the German U-boat attacks and a loss of cargo capacity to the military. So imports from Hawaii, they faced similar challenges as well from the Japanese. And poor weather in Puerto Rico, a general lack of fertilizer, and shortage of agricultural labor because of the war. So it also limited how much sugar was available. So to make sure that the military and the manufacturers and the civilians had enough sugar, it was the first food to be rationed. It was actually the first and the last food to be rationed. In late April of 1942, sugar sales were halted so the government could implement the ration system and also to prevent hoarding. And families registered at their local school, and each person, including children, received their own ration book. And they were allotted 26 pounds per year, which is about 8 ounces or half a pound every single week. Half of the per capita use in 1941. Okay, so when they picked up their ration book on May 5th, they had to disclose how much sugar they already had in their pantries, and an equivalent number of stamps were then removed from their book. So each stamp was initially worth 1 pound of sugar, and that had to be spent in a given 2-week period. In June of 1942, the OPA made each sugar stamp worth 2 pounds and gave consumers a month to use each one. Now, institutions and industries, they also faced the sugar rationing. And institutions like restaurants, hotels, hospitals, they had their average. In 1941, sugar use was cut in half. So industries were cut to 70% of their 1941 use. And rumors abound that sugar rationing was unnecessary and that there was plenty to go around. And more than one person suggested that the cutbacks were to promote the health of Americans. So when there is, or was, I should say, excess sugar that was available due to increased shipping amounts and improved island transportation, both the consumer and the industry received more. But when there were shortages, amounts were cut. Early in 1945, when the U.S. began to provide food for the citizens of Allied countries, the sugar shortage became acute. On February 1st of 1945, the consumer sugar ration was cut to 20 pounds. On May 1st of 1945, the sugar ration was cut yet again to 15 pounds, and additional amounts of sugar were available to those canning their own foods. So initially, 25 pounds per person per year in May of 1945 was then decreased to 15 pounds. The amount of sugar for canning available to a family living together was also limited. It was capped at the total available to 8 individuals, meaning that families of 9 or more received less per person. Then, when World War II ended, the global sugar supply was extremely low. This was due to disruptions from the war, as well as poor crop yields in 1944. To help give the market time to recover, the U.S. government then kept sugar under ration until June of 1947. Other sources of sweetener were not rationed during World War II. Instead of sugar, people would use corn syrup, molasses, maple syrup, and prepared foods. In March of 1942, immediately after the sugar was rationed, American Cookery magazine, they published a guide for substitutions, just like how I did that the food substitution video for you the other day. Well, they did the same thing, but back then. Each cup of granulated sugar in a recipe could be replaced with a cup of molasses. Add half a teaspoon of baking soda when baking. Cakes are heavier, but they stay moist longer. Or you can add 1 1/4 cup of maple syrup and reduce the liquid in the recipe by half. Add a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda when baking. It's good on cereals and puddings and sauces. Or you could do 1 cup of honey, reduce the liquid by 1/4, add 1/8 of a teaspoon of baking soda when baking, which is optional. The thickness of the honey must be considered in any use as a substitute. Or you could use 1 cup of corn syrup, reduce the liquid by 1/3, and add a 1/8 teaspoon of baking soda when baking, which was also optional. It was good in custards, muffins, drop cookies, cakes, frostings, and also for preserving your fruits. So because sugar in prepared foods like gelatin, soda, sweetened condensed milk did not count towards an individual's sugar ration, people used non-sugar ration points to increase the amounts of sugar that they were actually using. And people also used fruits to sweeten baked goods like applesauce and cake, or raisins for frosting. Other foods that were rationed include coffee, cheese, and dried and processed foods. Now, people were encouraged to grow their own produce in family and community gardens known as victory gardens. I call them freedom gardens now. People were urged to plant gardens in rural and also in urban settings to offset the food rations, add vitamins to your diet, and support the war effort. And the use of food throughout effective production, consumption, and preservation was presented by the government as Patriots Act to help the troops in the nation. Historians estimate that by 1943, up to 20 million victory gardens were cultivated. How amazing is that? And this helped sustain the needs of the country. Although wartime propaganda tended to portray gardening as a masculine activity, a wide variety of the population helped to grow the produce, including women and children. So canning in wartime became a major focus of the U.S. government, and women were encouraged to support their families and their nation by canning produce that was grown in their garden. Canning, like gardening, was presented in official propaganda as a patriotic and unifying act, linking soldiers' activities to women's roles in the kitchen. Government officials asked individuals to organize their activities, ensured that the victory of the gardens yields reached their peak in 1943. So too did canning levels. So you know how we pressure can a lot of food? We don't touch what they did. So the USDA, they estimate that approximately 4 billion cans and jars of food, both sweet and savory, were produced that year. Community canning centers, they also aided in the process of reaching record levels of preserved foods in the United States during the war. In 1945, the USDA stated that 6,000 canning centers were in operation throughout the United States. And these centers were locally sponsored and financially supported, but with instructional and educational oversight provided by the USDA. And the government issued handy bulletins outlining the process of canning, including the use of water baths and pressure cookers for low-acid food. It also provided guidelines as to cooking times and temperatures for the preservation of different foods. Within the centers, a home demonstrator from the Extension Services or a locally qualified individual was on hand to supervise and instruct users on canning techniques. Individuals brought their raw produce to the center, paid a small fee, or donated a small quantity of their preserved food in return for the use of the materials. With the rationing of vital metal goods for the war effort, pressure cookers were not produced for much in World War II. The centers offered women the opportunity to use this equipment if they did not have their own device or are unable to borrow one from family and friends. Now here's something else. Tires. Tires were the first item to be rationed by the OPA, which ordered the temporary end of sales on December 11th, 1941, while it created 7,500 unpaid volunteer three-person tire ration boards around the country. By January 5th of 1942, the boards were ready. Each received a monthly allotment of tires based on the number of local vehicle registrations and allocated them to applicants based on the OPA rules. There was a shortage of natural rubber for tires since the Japanese quickly conquered the rubber-producing regions in Southeast Asia. Although synthetic rubber had been invented before the war, it had been unable to compete with natural rubber commercially, so the U.S. did not have enough manufacturing capacity at the time of the war to make synthetic rubber. Throughout the war, though, rationing of gas was motivated by a desire to conserve rubber as much as by a desire to conserve gas. Now, as of March 1st, 1942, dog food could no longer be sold in tin cans. Manufacturers switched to dehydrated versions like the kibble that we feed our dogs today. And as of April 1st of 1942, anyone wishing to purchase a new toothpaste tube, then made from metal, had to turn in an empty one. By June of 1942, companies also stopped manufacturing metal office furniture, radios, television sets, phonographs, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, sewing machines, and all for civilians. So by the end of 1942, ration coupons were used for 9 other items: typewriters, gas, bicycles, shoes, rubber footwear, silk, nylon, fuel oil, and stoves. Meat and lard and shortening and food oils, cheese, butter, margarine, processed foods like canned, bottled, or frozen, dried fruits, canned milk, firewood, and coal, jams and jellies, and fruit butter were rationed by November of 1943. No, Stormy, don't do that. Many retailers, I'm sorry, he's an attention seeker. Many retailers welcomed rationing because they were already experiencing these shortages of many items due to rumors and also panics such as flashlights and batteries after Pearl Harbor. And ration book number 5 is a very, very rare ration book, and it's only issued to a few people. So now, coffee shops. They are today the most common thing that you will see anywhere. Nearly every street corner, airport, hotel, grocery store, they offer coffee in a myriad of forms. Yet, this was not the case during World War II. From 1942 to the immediate post-war years, American military and civilians experienced coffee rationing. So coffee has also been a long mainstay of many, many cultures. With its bitter taste and stimulating effects of caffeine, coffee was evolved as a drug of choice and is enjoyed in the Middle East to Europe to Americans. Coffee was the most important beverage to serve our Army troops. The War Department considered coffee an essential element to the troops' diet as it lifted welfare and morale of the men. Military men believed that a warm cup of coffee completed the ration meal. In fact, the Army, they said that it was 10 times more coffee in 1942 than in 1941 before Pearl Harbor. The War Department, they developed different types of rations for the U.S. troops, and coffee allotments varied with ration type. The garrison ration was issued for peace items, troop traveling, who were separated from field kitchens, or for national emergencies. For troops in active combat, the Army Field Forces commanders issued C, K, or D rations, each including high-calorie foodstuffs. Powdered coffee was delivered in C rations to military troops, whereas field ration K was issued with 5 grams soluble coffee at breakfast only. In contrast, the peacetime or garrison rations consisted of 2 ounces of roasted and ground coffee. Whatever the form of coffee provided, soldiers in the field often found it difficult to boil the water needed to prepare it, so soldiers warmed up water over little candles. Now, food rationing on the home front took a toll on civilians accustomed to coffee consumption, and the primary reason for wartime rationing was the equitable distribution of limited quantities of food to the American people. A second reason was to rally support for the European war. Now, rationing of meat and cheese was an important part of life in the U.S. home front. A complex and constantly changing system kept grocery shoppers on their toes. Now, the United States produced meat and cheese for their civilians and for the military, and also for her allies. During World War I, food shortages were a serious problem, with hoarding, escalating prices, rushes on the stores, and then when World War II started, the government reduced deliveries to stores and restaurants, instituted price controls, and urged people to voluntarily reduce consumption. Britain had already instituted a point-based ration system and had found it effective, so the United States decided to implement a similar project in 1943. Rationing made sure everyone got a fair share. Now, on March 29, 1943, meats and cheeses were added to the rationing. Rationing meats, including beef, pork, veal, lamb, tinned cans of meats and fish, poultry, eggs, fresh fruit, and Spam, they were not rationed. But cheese rationing started with hard cheeses, since they were more easily shipped overseas. However, on June 2, 1943, rationing was expanded to cream cheese, cottage cheese, and canned and evaporated condensed milk. So War Ration Books 2, 3, and 4, they contained blued stamps for processed food and red stamps for meat, cheese, and fats. Each person received 64 red stamps each month, providing 28 ounces of meat, 4 ounces of cheese per week. The stamps were printed with a number for point value and a letter to specify the rationing period, such as C8. Rationing calendars in newspapers declared which stamps were current and for how long. To prevent fraud, the stamps had to be torn off in the presence of the grocer, and stamps were good for 1, 2, 5, or 8 points with no change given. So the shopper had to be careful to use the exact number of stamps. The system was simplified on February 27, 1944, when plastic tokens were issued as change. Each cut of meat was assigned a point value per pound, based not on price or quality, but on scarcity. So these point values, they varied through the war, depending on supply and demand. Variety meats like kidney, liver, brain, tongue had very little use for the military. So on May 3rd, 1944, thanks to a good supply, all meats except for steak and choice cuts of beef were removed from rationing temporarily. After D-Day, on June 1944, newly liberated countries required food for their war-ravaged land that they couldn't produce. So the United States, they stepped forward to meet those needs, but shortages, they resulted on the home front. So for Thanksgiving of 1944, the supply of turkeys was very short. And on December 31st, 1944, all meats were returned to rationing. Even with the tightening rationing, a serious meat shortage developed in the spring and summer of 1945. San Diego, they reported a 55% decrease in the meat supply. San Francisco, only lamb and sausage was available. For the first time, even chicken and eggs were in short supply. Things improved, though, after the victory parades, and on November 23rd, 1945, meat and cheese rationing came to an end finally. Throughout the war, American housewives learned to make do with less meat. Chicken and rabbit hutches, they sprung up all over backyards, and people were encouraged to fish. Patriotic citizens observed Meatless Tuesdays and cut meatless recipes out of newspapers and magazines. Soups, stews, casseroles, they helped stretch the meat ration, and housewives learn to adapt recipes to organ meats and poultry. Right, Stormy? Well, I hope this video helped you guys, okay, to see what the foods were that were rationed and will probably be rationed again in the case that we see WW3. All right, guys, I'm out of here. I will see you in the next one, okay? You stay safe, you stay positive, you keep prepping. And as always, fear less. Ciao.